The room went quiet the moment he walked in, not gradually. Not the way noise fades when someone important enters. It stopped the way sound stops when people are caught doing something they shouldn't be. Sudden, total, and followed immediately by the particular discomfort of not knowing where to look. He stood at the entrance of the Harrington Club's main hall, a man of perhaps 58, wearing a navy blazer that had seen better decades. His shoes were polished but old. His hair was silver at the temples and not particularly styled. He held no drink. He carried no gift bag. He simply stood there, unhurried, and took in the room the way a man takes in a landscape he has known for a long time. His name was Hugh Gallagher. Almost no one in that room knew that name. Almost no one recognized his face. And that, as it turned out, would become the most expensive mistake several of them had ever made. It had started 6 weeks earlier, on a Tuesday morning in late November, in the lobby of the Caldwell and Reece Financial Tower on Bay Street in Toronto. The building was the kind that made a statement before you even pushed through the glass doors. 42 floors of steel and ambition, the sort of architecture that said money not as a whisper but as a declaration. Hugh Gallagher arrived at 7:15, the way he always did. He wore the same type of jacket he always wore, carried the same battered canvas bag, and nodded to the same security guard, a young man named Pete, who had worked the morning desk for 3 years and was the only person in the building who called him by his first name. "Morning, Hugh. Morning, Pete. How's your mother?" "Better. They moved her out of ICU yesterday." "That's good news." Hugh paused, set down his bag, and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "Give her these when you visit. They're from the garden. Nothing fancy." Pete unfolded it carefully. Inside were pressed maple leaves, dried and mounted on cream paper, the kind of small gesture that costs nothing and means everything when someone is lying in a hospital bed in December. Then Hugh picked up his bag and took the service elevator to the 14th floor, where the janitorial supply room was located, and began his shift. He had worked in the building for 4 years. In that time, he had learned the layout of every floor, the names of every overnight security officer, the preferred coffee order of the woman who cleaned the executive bathrooms on 38. And the particular way the heating vents on the 20th floor rattled when the temperature dropped below -10. He was thorough, and he was quiet, and he was, as far as anyone in the building knew, simply the man who kept the floors clean. What they did not know, what he had not told them, and had no particular reason to, was that Hugh Gallagher had sold his logistics company 11 years ago for a figure that had multiple commas in it, that he sat on the boards of 3 charities, that he had spent the 2 years following the sale traveling alone, doing exactly nothing that could be called productive, until the nothing began to feel like an answer to a question he hadn't known he was asking. That he had come back to Toronto, looked at the city he had spent 30 years accumulating things in, and decided, for reasons he kept mostly to himself, that he wanted to spend some time close to the ground again. He told his daughter, Faye, who was 31 and worked in urban planning, and thought he had perhaps lost his mind. "You're going to clean floors," she said. "I am, because you want to, because I think I've forgotten what things look like from the bottom of a building." Faye had looked at him for a long time. "Does this have something to do with Mom?" He had not answered that directly, but the answer, if he were being honest with himself, was yes, at least in part. His wife, Caroline, had worked as a hospital cleaner for 14 years before her illness. She had talked about the invisibility of it, how people looked past her, through her, around her, how she had learned to read a room simply by watching people fail to notice her. He had listened, back then, but he had not understood. He understood now. The 32nd floor housed the offices of Caldwell and Reece's senior executive team. This was where Melissa Reece operated. Melissa Reece was 44 years old, the daughter of one of the firm's original partners, and had been managing director for 6 years. She was, by every external measure, formidable. She had the kind of intelligence that moved quickly, the kind of confidence that filled rooms, and the kind of social radar that could identify, within 30 seconds of meeting someone, exactly where they sat in any hierarchy that mattered to her. She wore this skill the way some people wear expensive watches, not subtly but not quite brazenly either. As a fact, she was also, as Hugh had observed over 4 years of cleaning her floor, genuinely funny when she chose to be. She was good to her assistant. She remembered people's names. She had, on at least 2 occasions that he had witnessed, defended junior employees in meetings when she didn't have to. These were the parts of her that he found himself thinking about on the days when the other parts were harder to reconcile. The other parts being primarily the way she spoke when she thought no one important was listening. It was a Wednesday 3 weeks before the gala when Hugh first heard his name used in a sentence that was meant to be a joke. He had been working near the supply closet at the end of the east corridor, replacing a light fixture that maintenance had missed. The door to the small boardroom was open. Not wide, just the few inches that doors settle into when they aren't quite latched, and the voices from inside carried with the ease of voices that expect no audience. Melissa Reece was talking to two of her senior colleagues, a man named Philip Crane, who ran fixed income, and a woman named Julia Starro, who headed client relations. They were discussing the firm's annual charity gala, a black tie event at the Harrington Club 3 weeks away. "I need a table of 10 and I'm 1 short," Melissa said. "Clifford's wife had a hip replacement. Ask someone from the Wellington account," Julia suggested. "They're all at the Brandt table. I'd sooner go short." A pause, the sound of a pen clicking. Though honestly, at this point I'd invite the cleaning man from the hall if it meant filling a chair. Philip laughed. "I don't think he owns a tie. He might surprise you." But Melissa's tone made clear she did not actually believe this. It was the tone of someone saying the benevolent-sounding thing, the thing that lets you feel inclusive while ensuring inclusion never actually occurs. Though I'm not sure he'd know what to do with a fish fork. More laughter. Hugh finished replacing the light fixture. He set his tools back in his bag with the same deliberateness he brought to everything. Then he walked past the boardroom door, which was still ajar by a few inches, and he paused. He knocked twice, lightly. Melissa's head turned. The other two looked up. "Sorry to interrupt," Hugh said. "The bulb on the south exit sign is out. I'll have it replaced by end of day, but I wanted to let you know in case anyone was wondering about the red light." "Oh," Melissa blinked. "Thank you." "Of course." He nodded and left. He did not look back, so he did not see whatever passed between them after he walked away. He didn't need to. He had heard everything he needed to hear, and he carried it with him the way you carry something when you're not yet sure what to do with it, carefully and out of sight. He thought about it that evening in the kitchen of his house in Leslieville, a narrow Victorian semi that he had bought in the 90s when the neighborhood was still rough around the edges, and had never quite gotten around to updating beyond what was necessary. The kitchen still had the original tile. The cupboards were painted the color of old cream. He made himself rice and lentils and ate standing at the counter, which was a habit his daughter found alarming and he found efficient. He thought about Melissa Reece and about what she had said and about whether it had been unkind. He decided, on consideration, that it had been unkind the way thoughtlessness is unkind. Not with malice, but with a casual willingness to not think of someone as fully real. That, he had learned from Caroline, was often worse than malice. Malice at least required you to acknowledge the person existed. He also thought about the gala. He had been to the Harrington Club exactly once before, 17 years ago, for a dinner he had hosted himself. He remembered the fish forks. He picked up his phone and called Faye. "I need a suit," he said, a pause. "For what? A gala?" Another pause, longer. "Dad, what are you doing?" "Nothing dramatic," he said. "I just want to see how a room looks when you walk into it differently." He told Melissa the next morning. He found her alone at the coffee station on 32, which happened rarely enough that he recognized it as an opportunity. She looked up when he approached, not unkindly, the way she always looked at him, which was the particular look of someone who is perfectly pleasant and does not quite see you. "Mrs. Reece," he said, "I understand you're a seat short for the gala." She blinked. "Sorry?" "At the Harrington, 3 weeks from Saturday. I believe you mentioned it yesterday." The briefest of hesitations crossed her face, the hesitation of someone doing rapid and not entirely comfortable math. Yes. We are, as it happens. I'd be glad to fill it if the offer was genuine." The silence that followed lasted perhaps 4 seconds. It had several distinct layers. The first was simple surprise. The second was something that looked, if you watched her carefully, like the beginning of amusement. And the third, the one she landed on and chose to wear, was the warmth of someone who has made a private decision that costs her nothing. "Of course," Melissa said. "You're absolutely welcome, Hugh." She said his name the way people say names when they've just remembered them. "Black tie. It starts at 7. "Thank you," he said. "I'll be there." He went back to his cart. Behind him, he heard her take out her phone. He suspected she was already composing a message to Julia Straro, though he would never know for certain what it said. He suspected it was funny, and that it was at his expense, and that both of those things seemed entirely reasonable to Melissa Reece at that particular moment in the morning. The suit had been his idea, the rest had been Faye's. She drove him to a tailor on Queen West on a Saturday afternoon, a small shop run by a Portuguese man named Antonio, who had been making clothes for Toronto's quieter class of wealthy for 30 years, and who greeted Hugh at the door with the recognition of an old acquaintance. "It's been too long," Antonio said, and ushered them in without ceremony. "You know him?" Faye whispered. "We've met a few times," Hugh said. This was an understatement. Antonio had made the suit Hugh wore to Caroline's funeral and the one he wore to the company sale closing dinner, and 3 others besides. He knew Hugh's measurements the way a good craftsman knows a particular piece of wood, not just the dimensions, but the nature of it. They chose a charcoal wool with a subtle herringbone, nothing that announced itself, everything that held up to looking at. "You're going to walk into a room," Antonio said, pinning the jacket's shoulder, "and someone is going to feel very foolish." "That's not really the point," Hugh said. "I know," Antonio said. "That's why it'll work." Faye sat in the corner and said nothing for a while. Then, Mom would have found this hilarious. Hugh looked at himself in the fitting mirror, the man in the gray suit, the silver at his temples, the hands that had carried a mop and signed acquisition documents and held his wife's hand in a hospital bed at the end. "Yes," he said. "She would have." He arrived at the Harrington Club at 7:10. He gave his name at the door and was shown inside without the particular pause that might have occurred if he had arrived in his work clothes. The room was already half full, the particular half full of people who arrive early enough to be seen arriving, but not so early as to seem eager. Crystal caught the light. There were flowers of the expensive, architectural kind. Someone was playing piano. Hugh took a glass of sparkling water from a passing tray and stood near the window, looking out at the city. From this floor, on a clear December night, you could see the lake. He heard the room shift before he heard anything specific. It was the particular acoustic change that happens when a significant number of people register the same thing at approximately the same moment. A collective adjustment, small and involuntary, like a flock of birds changing direction. He turned. Melissa Reece had arrived with her party, and she had seen him. She stood perhaps 15 feet away, in a green gown, with the expression of someone whose mental footing has become suddenly uncertain. Philip Crane was at her elbow. Julia Straro was half a step behind. Both of them were looking at Hugh with expressions that ranged from confused to startled. Hugh raised his glass slightly, a small, unhurried gesture, and held her gaze. She came toward him because there was nothing else to do. "Hugh," she said it with a smile that was working harder than smiles should have to work. "You came. You invited me," he said. "I did. A beat. You look well." "Thank you, so do you." Philip Crane extended a hand with the reflex of someone who has been trained to extend hands. Philip Crane, Hugh Gallagher. He shook it. The name landed differently than Philip had expected. Hugh could see it, a small flicker, almost nothing, there and gone. Not recognition, not yet. Just the sensation of a name that ought to be recognized and wasn't quite. Julia Straro said something about the room looking beautiful. Hugh agreed. The piano moved into something by Debussy. The evening proceeded. What changed the temperature of the room happened gradually, then quickly, in the way of many important things. It began at the cocktail hour. A man named Bertrand Holloway, silver-haired, the sort of substantial presence that comes from decades of controlled authority, crossed the room toward Hugh with the directness of someone who has identified what he came looking for. "Hugh Gallagher," Bertrand said and extended his hand. "Bertrand." Hugh took it. "It's been a few years. 5. The Halifax conference. That's right. How's Miriam? Terrific. Just got back from Portugal." A pause while Bertrand's eyes did the brief inventory that eyes do. "I didn't know you were connected to Caldwell and Reece. I work in the building," Hugh said. There was a small silence in which Bertrand chose, wisely, not to ask the obvious follow-up question, because men like Bertrand Holloway learn early that the obvious follow-up question is frequently the wrong one. Melissa was 3 feet away and had heard the exchange. Bertrand Holloway was the founder of Holloway Capital, which managed approximately $4 billion in private equity, and was, as it happened, the single largest client that Caldwell and Reece had spent the last 8 months attempting to acquire. Melissa knew this. She also now knew, though she had not known it until this precise moment, that the man who cleaned her floor and the man whose account she had been courting for the better part of a year were already on a first-name basis. She held this knowledge the way you hold something hot, very still, very carefully, trying not to show that it was burning. Over the course of the next 40 minutes, Hugh spoke with 7 people. He spoke with Eleanor Vance, who ran the Pemberton Foundation, which funded most of the arts programming in the city's eastern communities. He had known Eleanor for 12 years, since before the foundation existed, when she was trying to raise the first round of capital, and he had written a check that no one in that room currently knew about. He spoke with a judge named Arthur Gwynn, whom he had met through a mutual friend in Vancouver 20 years ago, and who greeted him with the ease of old colleagues. He spoke with a woman named Priscilla Tan, who headed a downtown development company, and who had once called Hugh the most underrated deal-maker she had encountered in 20 years of property transactions. She said something similar now, quietly, and Hugh thanked her and moved on. Each conversation was brief. None of it was performed. He was not working the room. He genuinely knew these people, had history with them, cared in the ordinary human way about how they were doing. But the cumulative effect, observed from a distance of several feet by Melissa Reece, and, increasingly, by Philip Crane and Julia Starro, was significant. By the time the dinner bell sounded and the guests moved toward the dining room, the 3 of them had had a silent, paralyzing conversation that involved no words at all. At dinner, Hugh was seated at Melissa's table. She had arranged it herself 6 weeks ago, intending it as the end of a joke. The cleaning man at the table, briefly, a good story for later. The irony of this arrangement had not escaped her. She sat now with the posture of someone maintaining composure through effort, which is a different kind of posture than the kind that comes naturally. He was placed between Eleanor Vance and a retired federal cabinet minister named George Ashby, who had known Hugh since the mid-90s and who spent the first 10 minutes of dinner asking Hugh's opinion on infrastructure funding in mid-sized cities, which Hugh gave thoughtfully and which George wrote on a napkin. Philip Crane from across the table watched this and said nothing. Julia Starro ate her soup with concentrated attention. Melissa Reece, seated to Hugh's left, waited until Eleanor was engaged in a separate conversation before she said quietly, "I owe you an apology." Hugh set down his fork. "Do you?" She looked at him directly, which he respected. "I think you may have heard what I said in the boardroom 3 weeks ago." He was quiet for a moment. Not uncomfortable quiet, the kind of quiet that means something is being considered. "I did. It was unkind. It was." She absorbed this without visible flinching, which he also respected. "I assumed things about you that I had no basis for." "You assumed things that seemed perfectly reasonable given what you could observe," he said. "That's the whole problem, isn't it? The assumptions aren't unreasonable. That's what makes them so easy to keep." She looked at him. "You don't seem angry." "I'm not angry. I'm a little disappointed, I suppose. But mostly I'm interested." He picked up his fork again. "I spent 4 years watching people in that building. You're not unkind, Melissa. That's not what I'd call you. You're incurious about certain people. And that's a different thing. But it can do the same damage." The table had grown slightly quiet around them. Not all of it, not conspicuously, but the way tables do when a nearby conversation has weight. Melissa said nothing for a moment. Then, "How long have you known Bertrand Holloway?" "About 15 years. A pause. "Did you plan this?" "I planned to come to a dinner I was invited to." She held his gaze for another moment, then looked down at her plate. Something had shifted in her face. Not collapse, not humiliation exactly, but the particular rearrangement that happens when a person confronts the distance between who they believe themselves to be and who they have actually been in a specific moment. It was not a comfortable thing to watch. Hugh did not look away. "The fish fork," she said quietly. He almost smiled. "I know which one to use." The dessert course came and went. The room softened into the particular atmosphere of the latter part of a formal dinner. Ties loosened. Voices warmer, the particular laughter of people who have eaten and drunk and exist, for a few hours, in the pleasant suspension of their ordinary concerns. Bertrand Holloway stopped by the table before he left and told Hugh they should have lunch in the new year. He left a card. George Ashby told a story about a fishing trip in New Brunswick that had the whole table laughing. Eleanor Vance, in departing, pressed Hugh's hand and said it was always good to see him. Philip Crane watched all of this. He had the expression of a man revising a document he'd thought was final. Julia Storrow said to Melissa in a low voice that Hugh was not intended to hear but that the acoustics of the room delivered clearly. "Why didn't you tell us who he was?" Melissa said. "I didn't know," Julia said. "How did you not know?" Melissa said. Quietly, "Because I didn't ask." Hugh collected his coat from the cloakroom just after 10. He tipped the attendant, a young woman working her second job, and asked if her name was on the list for the Pemberton Foundation scholarship that Eleanor Vance's organization offered to mature students in the service sector. The young woman looked at him with surprise and said she hadn't heard of it. He told her to look it up, wrote the website on a Harrington Club card from the counter, and handed it to her. Then he walked out into the December night. The city was cold and clear. Bay Street at this hour was mostly quiet, the daytime noise of commerce replaced by the empty authority of lit towers against a dark sky. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment and breathed the air, which tasted of car exhaust in winter, and underneath it all, the familiar cold mineral smell of Lake Ontario. He thought about Caroline. He thought about the way she used to describe the lobby of the hospital where she worked. How she could tell, within about 30 seconds, which patients would look at her and which would look through her. How she had made a game of it, cataloging the ones who saw her, keeping them in a private ledger that she described once as one of the most interesting documents she had never written down. He thought about how she had told him this, not with bitterness, but with the anthropological interest she brought to everything, and how he had listened and thought he understood, and how he had not understood at all, not really, until he had spent 4 years in the same invisibility himself. He understood now. That was something. He started walking toward the parking garage on Adelaide. His car was a 2009 Volvo with a cracked dashboard and a check engine light that had been on for so long it had become a feature rather than a warning. He had, as a matter of fact, never found fish forks difficult. He saw Melissa Reece in the elevator on the following Monday morning. This was not unusual. He often arrived in time to catch the executive elevator before the lobby filled. She was already inside when the doors opened on the parking level, and for a fraction of a second he watched her face do something it had never done before in his presence, which was register him as a person to be reckoned with before composing itself into normal professional warmth. "Good morning," she said. "Morning," he stepped in. The doors closed. They rode in silence for 2 floors. Then Melissa said, without looking at him, "I spoke with Bertrand Holloway this morning. He mentioned he's going to bring his account to us. That's good news for the firm. He said to tell you, and I'm quoting here, that working with people who understand what work actually looks like is the only reason he trusts anyone anymore." Hugh watched the floor numbers rise. "I've been thinking," Melissa said, "about what you said, about being incurious. I don't want you to feel badly about it. I don't think feeling badly about it is the point." She glanced at him sideways. "I think the point is to be less incurious." The elevator opened on 32. She stepped out, then turned back before the doors could close. "Hugh, for what it's worth, you're the best we have at keeping the South Corridor clean. I notice it every morning. I just never said anything." The doors began to close. "I appreciate that," he said, and he meant it. Not as a concession, not as a smaller thing than the rest of the evening, as what it was, which was a person deciding one morning to say the thing they had not said to the person they had failed to see. The elevator continued up. Hugh rode it to 14, stepped out, collected his cart, and began his shift the way he always did. Thoroughly, quietly, without ceremony, in the particular way of a man who knows that the floor he is standing on is, in every sense that matters, as good a place as any to begin.